Hi, welcome to another edition of Music Pro Musings with Danny J. Lewis. Now, in this episode, we're going to talk about the Nelson Gap. And this is something that I've written about. And, I was saying essentially the Nelson Gap is a framework for success in the Tracksource Garage chart. Now, much like climbing Mount Everest or making it to the top of Kilimanjaro, getting to number one on the Tracksource Garage chart is an aspiration for all house and garage producers. Having the accolade, regardless of the amount of sales, is a badge of prestige, especially at the end of the year when the Tracksource best-of statistics are revealed. And this is where the lucky ones count up their top slots and proudly display them on social media for everyone to see. However, much like the incredibly challenging weather and conditions on those mountain climbs, there is often an unforeseeable obstacle, and that is when the legendary producer Grant Nelson puts out releases, and of course they are utterly dominating on the chart. Now, it's therefore with much caution and trepidation that any music producer is going to release their music on Tracksource because of this complete and utter fear that Grant might release a single in the same time frame. Now, when Grant posts a link about a brand new track forthcoming on social media, you can bet that it's not forthcoming in the traditional sense. What usually happens is mercilessly that is going to drop tomorrow, or maybe even worse, at exactly the same time. What Grant doesn't tend to do is give advance warnings. These things drop and they create a massive impact. So it's at this point that nobody else in the world has actually got a hope in hell of making it to the top. Grant will stay at the top of that chart, usually for over a month, and then his other prior releases tend to get buoyancy on the chart as well. So they will often resurface in the top 100. The track that is at the top creates a fresh awareness, and Grant's music is extremely high quality. He's a very, very talented, experienced producer. So it's no surprise, right? So the gaps between, his releases, these safe release windows as such, this is the only opportunity where others can get to the top of the chart. And it's become known to some of us in the industry as the Nelson Gap. So these gaps where Grant Nelson is not releasing a single on the Tracksource Garage chart are opportunities for the rest of us. So this is a chance for those who are not going to sell as much to at least get their chance to kind of poke their heads above the ramparts as such and earn some money and some attention for a few fleeting moments. These periods are going to be short-lived, potentially. Lots of tracks only last for about 2 weeks, for most people. But Grant does have this ability to have this kind of sustained long-term high performance, and I know Grant here, he's a fantastic guy. So this is certainly not a dig, this is just reality. It's just important for people. I think, with this podcast series, what I'm trying to do is to kind of bring up some stuff that's just kind of honest and real, and even though I've been making music for a long period of time and I have my own, fan base support, etc. It's my success in terms of these charts is nowhere near as large as Grant, so it's just one of those things, It's not going to stop me releasing music. And in fact, I know that we're talking about this idea of the Nelson Gap. I certainly don't immediately after Grant's tracks have disappeared in the charts consider putting a release out. So I'm certainly aware of it. I wouldn't certainly, if I had a choice, if I hadn't been scheduling something in advance, then yes, I would probably say, yeah, I'm going to avoid it. But it's not a very, very conscious thing. I tend to work personally on the basis of just putting stuff out when I feel like it. That's the kind of common thread, really. And sometimes that works in my favor, sometimes it doesn't. Of course, if I did choose to do so when Grant's got a release, it's probably going to be nowhere near the top. So anyway, this is something I think is very, very interesting. It's going to be the same on all of the different scenes. And I know that I'm talking specifically with regards to Traxsource, the Garage chart here, but equally there will be other names on other scenes. And, perhaps it is a good idea to keep track of a pattern. Maybe it's good to try to observe. Is there a schedule? Some people do work on very, very specific schedules. Some people map things out meticulously in advance. Others don't. So maybe if you're in a scene where there is a producer that always does well, goes straight to the top of the chart and is sustained there, maybe try to make a calendar, observe the behavior of those songs in those periods and film up in a way, a kind of a template, a guide, a point, an area where you can maybe seek those opportunities to jump in. Because I know that ultimately, at the end of the day, the sales results will be different. So for example, my number one is not going to sell as many copies as a Grant Nelson number one. So there's always going to be that essence, but it's more about the fact that, as a milestone, an achievement, an accolade, getting a number one is a great thing. And it's just for those of us who, in some respects, need to get some form of a reward or validation, I guess, of what we do. Those high positions are important as part of the process. It's nice to know that you're currently at that point in time the one selling the most. So it's the important thing is that it's going to be relative. One person's number one certainly does not sell as much as somebody else's number one. But as I said, the personal reward, if you're that kind of a person, is there. So yes, this has been slightly humorous. This idea of the Nelson gap. There will probably be other big names that you could use to have a similar idea of a gap. But the main purpose of this particular episode is really just to allow you to get awareness of the fact that there will always be bigger fish. And sometimes it's good to essentially navigate around them. So it's just food for thought, really.